Have you ever looked at the Starbucks logo and wondered who or what that mythological creature was on it? Some say she's a mermaid, some say she's a siren, and others a sea nymph. In actuality, the beautiful maiden that is shown with a crown upon her head and two mermaid-like tails is none other than Melusine. In ancient medieval times, the tale of Melusine, or sometimes Melusine, is spoken in reference to a water fairy who was stricken with a condition of being half woman and serpentine, or half fish, every Saturday. The myths would often begin around spinning wheels, meaning that women were gossiping and telling stories while working. As long as Melusine's husband didn't see her on that one particular day of the week, Saturday, everything would be fine and normal. As with most fairy tales or legends, things don't go according to plan. Melusine, the daughter of Priscina, a full-fledged water fairy, and of a mortal man, King Elenus, wasn't always a mermaid. According to the myth, she was stricken with this ailment or condition after her mother found out what Melusine did to her father, King Elenus. King Elenus had met Priscina, the water fairy, at the Fountain of Thirst, and fell madly in love with her at first sight, and asked for her hand in marriage. Priscina agreed to marry the king under the condition that he never enter into her chambers during or just after childbirth. Shortly after the marriage, she became pregnant with triplets, and soon thereafter gave birth to 3 daughters, Melusine, Melior, and Plantina. King Elenus's curiosity got the best of him after his elder son, from a previous marriage, insisted that he go in and see his wife and new babies. Priscina was so overcome with sadness because her king had broken his promise that she takes the babies and runs away off to a hidden island. When the daughters are teenagers, Priscina takes the girls to look upon their father's realm. She tells the girls about the promise her father broke, and Melusine decides to seek revenge against her father. She convinces her 2 other sisters to help her kidnap their father and imprison him inside of a mountain. Once Priscina finds out about this, she becomes very upset and punishes Melusine by telling her that she will become a half fish or serpent creature every Saturday for the rest of her life. Melusine goes on living in the forest until one day she stumbles across a count, or in some versions a duke, who had been very distressed due to accidentally killing his uncle during a hunt. He was unsure what to do, but Melusine gave him advice on how to go about explaining the accidental death he caused of his uncle to his family, and further promised him that she would help him obtain riches, wealth, and power, to which he could never imagine. This helped ease his grief, and he was so pleased with Melusine's help that he asked her to be his bride. She agreed under one condition, that he could not see her in her chambers on Saturdays, no matter what. He agreed to the silly request, and they were married at once. Melusine helped him gain power to the kingdom and to build up the prosperous city, where Melusine became the mother of 10 children of now a royal lineage. She even had the castle built there and ruled over the land graciously and lovingly, adored and appreciated by her people. It was obvious, due to the time span of so many children being born, that they had been married for at least 10 years or more, when the Duke became pressured by his other family members about Melusine's odd Saturday activities. His curiosity increased when they informed him that she didn't like to attend Mass at their cathedral, and so he started wondering what she may be doing in her chambers by herself. In a fit of jealousy, thinking that she may also be cheating, he peeked through the keyhole in the door to her chambers, sees her bathing in a tub, appearing very beautiful as usual from the waist up, but from the waist down, her fish or serpent-like body splashed around with a fierce tail. He couldn't believe his eyes, and accused her of being a false serpent. Melusine is so distraught over the fact that He not only knew of her secret, and thus breaking his promise, but also that he announced to everyone what she really was. Some books say that Melusine then turned into a dragon and flew away, while others state that she jumped out of the window in her fish-like state and swam away into the river. She was said to visit her children some nights in human form, but other stories claim that she was a bad omen, and if you saw her flying around, that meant an impending death in the land. Many French royals, dating back to the days of Charlemagne, have claimed to have descended from Melusine's family line, or at least dating back to the time when the story took place, and were extremely fascinated with the legend. For example, the Plantagenet families, Angevin lineage, and the House of Anjou and Vere still claim lineage that date back to the story of Melusine. According to the book The Serpent and the Swan, the animal bride in folklore and literature, the name Melusine was used as an abbreviation of the words Mère des Lusignans, or Mother of the Lusignans. The House of Lusignan was a royal house of French origin which at various times ruled several principalities in Europe and the Levant, including the kingdoms of Jerusalem, Cyprus, and Armenia from the 12th through the 15th century during the Middle Ages. It also had great influence in England and France, with some derivations of the name Melusine paired with Greco-Roman deities and even Celtic origins. And when I say Celtic, that includes northwestern France or Brittany. Where there's a lot of information to interpret here, from an astrotheological context of fish, serpents, and dragons, there's also a cultural interpretation regarding bloodlines from the Middle East and Eurasia entering Europe, also associated with serpentine imagery. That said, for this presentation, let's examine the story from the perspective of anthropologist Dr. Sharona Frederick.
I'm fascinated by the folklore of all of the Celtic countries, and I don't know if you know, but now you do, that when I say the Celtic countries, part of that includes northwestern France. Is that clear to you? So when we talk about northwestern France, we have an amazing area there called Brittany, or Bretagne, right? And Brittany is part of the Celtic countries. And the story that we're going to analyze and take apart in all of its funny taffy-like substance, Melusine, or Melusina, as I grew up calling her in Spanish, she is a Celtic legend. The Celtic culture includes northwestern France, and frankly it also includes a lot of northwestern Spain. So you'll find the Melusine story, which finally comes into English at the very beginning of the early modern period, or what you can call the Renaissance in 1500. You'll find the Melusine story very widespread throughout the Celtic countries. That means you'll find this story everywhere in Ireland, Wales, Brittany in northwestern France, Galicia in northwestern Spain, but you'll also find it all over England, because once that translation was made in 1500 from Old French and from Old Irish, in which the story had also been written, into English, it became a much-loved, if indeed one of the creepiest of all fairy tales. So we have the English language Melusine in 1500, but actually one of the most popular versions of the Melusine legend, and we're also going to be looking at that tonight, is the German version. Because a version came into mid-15th century Germany where the Melusine character became so popular that she became an unofficial saint of the Catholic Church in Germany. And even more interesting than that, following Germany's profound religious schisms in the 16th century, when we had the great and very terrible battles between Lutheranism and the Catholic Church, Both Protestants and Catholics in Germany continued the custom, which actually you can still see in rural areas in Bavaria, of leaving offerings to Melusine, who became, in a popular sense, associated with the poor and the indigent. So she goes from being a rather bizarre two-tailed mermaid to being the patron saint, still with her two tails, of the poor and the indigent. She becomes a much loved figure despite her monstrosity. You see here is an image of a count by the name of Raymondine looking at Melusine in her toilette as she puts herself together, looking beautiful for him. But unfortunately, he has come on the one day that he's not supposed to come and see her, which is on a Saturday. And we'll see why that is, because this legend, welcome to everybody coming in, come in, sit down. This legend has many ramifications to it. When I was a child, I used to think that there was something vaguely anti-Semitic about the legend. I am of Judeo-Spanish background, what you call a Sephardic Jew, descended from the Jews who were expelled from Imperial Spain in 1492. And every time I would read Saturday, I would think, well, wait a minute, that's Shabbat in Jewish tradition. That's our day of rest. Why is Raymondine prohibited from seeing her on Shabbat? And my questions regarding some of the Jewish origins of the legend fuse with the Celtic origins of the legend, fuse with the Germanic origins of the legend. So we get a story that imbibes from at least 5 different cultures. Okay? There are German elements, there are Sephardic Jewish from the south of France elements. The larger picture is a Celtic matrix from Brittany. There are French elements which are not Celtic, because France, of course, has many nationalities in it. Are you aware of that? To be French is also to belong to different groups. You can be Catalan French. You can come from Languedoc and be French. There are many different ways to be French. So we have elements that come in from Paris, from the medieval storytellers of Paris, and those elements are not Celtic. We have many English medieval elements and English early modern elements. Early modern, folks, think 1492 to the very end of the 18th century. That's usually, maybe you grew up with that being called the Renaissance. I grew up with that being called the Renaissance too, until historians started realizing that you don't call a time period of religious warfare, slavery, and the Spanish Inquisition a Renaissance. So we call it the early modern period. Okay, and there are also many elements from Irish and Welsh legends that have come into the story. This is the glory of the folkloric tradition. Okay, and when the folkloric tradition was dying out in the 19th century, there were 2 brothers who went around Germany. Do you know who I'm talking about? The brothers Grimm. Literally collecting what was considered worthless stories. Thank heavens they did that, because thanks to the inspiration from the brothers Grimm, we got Lady Gregory doing the same thing in Ireland. We got Nathan Ausubel doing the same thing among Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jews. We got Andrew Lang doing the same thing all over the world, in China and West Africa. Don't let this tradition die. This comes from the oral tradition. The source is the story called Melusine the Siren, first written down in the mid-14th century by Jean, in French, Jean, Darras, D-A-R-R-A-S. That is the first summation of this story that had been rolling around different cultures and different countries, beginning in the Celtic area, rolling around, and ending in the Celtic area, meaning Brittany, Ireland, and Wales. So northwestern France, Ireland, and Wales, in the mid-14th century. Okay, so that's the origin, and that is really how we know of this story, though later on, again, the brothers Grimm will locate a whole bunch of tales about Melusine in rural Germany, and then that will also spark interest in what turned out to be the German written versions of the Melusine legend that actually go back to the late 15th century. Okay, now, does Melusine, who is a two-tailed mermaid, have any basis in fact? If she does, I'm going to scream. I think that would be rather frightening. But I want you to understand that she is viewed as the scion, the origin of the royal household of two places. The first is Luxembourg. The Duchy of Luxembourg. Are you familiar with Luxembourg? Teeny tiny little country, right? In Europe. With a vanishing bridge. At least that is what it is. One of the many things it's famous for. It's supposed to have a bridge that appears only once every 7 years and then disappears. And if you see that, but the entire household of the Duchy of Luxembourg traces its ancestry back to Melusine. But she is very much viewed as the founder of that dynasty in the early Middle Ages. When I say that term, I'm referring to around the 10th century. Okay, so she's viewed as a real character by some. Now that same house that she was believed to have been the founder of, the House of Lusignan, actually did run an entire island in the period of the Third and Fourth Crusades. That's about the 12th and the 13th century, on the island of Cyprus. So lo and behold, if any of you go to the island of Cyprus, you're going to find that just as in Luxembourg, Melusine is viewed as a real character and as the founder of these dynasties. This is particularly interesting, folks, because are you aware of the fact usually a woman is not credited with founding a dynasty in Western Europe? That generally belongs to men. This is how you can tell the Celtic origins of this story, because Celtic society stressed, I don't want to tell you it was completely matriarchal, but it stressed very much personages of strong women and of women founders as well as male founders. And so that's one of the many giveaways regarding the Celtic origins of this northwestern French story. Now, Melusine's story, in a much more innocent form, will also be the origin of Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid. And just by a show of hands, how many of you saw the Disney film of The Little Mermaid? Well, it was a very, very nice film. How many of you have ever read Henderson's story of The Little Mermaid? Okay, a little less, but still. His story is very tragic. His story absolutely rips your guts out. It is a tragedy with no happy resolution. And Andersen, although he toned down the more monstrous parts of the story, Melusine is looking very pretty there. We know that when she transforms one day a week, she's pretty horrific looking. Although he tones down the uglier aspects of the story for the sake of the children that he was writing for, Andersen had a very great social conscience, this magnificent Danish writer of the 19th century. And the Melusine story interested him because it was for him a model of the difficulties with which different cultural groups cannot come together. That's what he was seeing in 19th century Europe. I think we can see this, unfortunately, all over the world. So Melusine, or the Little Mermaid, as he renames her, becomes the symbol of the outsider, right? Who's willing to do anything to be accepted, except you know if you've read the story, there's no happy ending there. She dies. Okay? Which is a little bit of a sign of what would happen when you would do anything to be accepted, because cultural diffusion has to go both ways, right? You have to give and you have to get. And she gives and she doesn't get anything. So that is the origin of Andersen's story. By the way, that is not at all my theory. Andersen left many letters in which he spoke about his interest in European folklore in general, and his rewritings of many of these stories had a lot to do with the social meanings that Andersen found in those stories. So Melusine plays an important part in the stories of Hans Christian Andersen. Yes, hand. Thank you.
Is it the same mermaid used on Starbucks symbol?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
And you're going to see that in Kendra's Power. Yes, so now, that was a dreadful question to ask. because now you're going to see Melusine literally following you every time you have a latte. And it is a little bit odd to me, although I'm sure that Starbucks, since this is being filmed, let me just say this in case one of Starbucks' lawyers is there in the audience. I'm assuming Starbucks made some sort of agreement with the House of Lusignan, which still exists, by the way. The descendants of the House of Lusignan, because that is, specifically the Starbucks image comes from an earlier 15th century woodcut. Okay, of the kind of ghastly, smiling mermaid with two tails. So the first time that shows up in Seattle back in 1991, right, in Pike's Coffee House, I don't know if they'd asked for the copyright at that point, but that image was not one they'd invented, it was one they had transposed, that specific image. Thank you very much for asking that question. Anything else? Please don't feel embarrassed. Yes?
Well, are both of her tails fish tails, or looking at the one on the right, trying to see, or is it like a snake?
So that's a fantastic question. And that question emphasizes the blurring that I was mentioning with Anderson. If you read Jean d'Arras's actual text from the 14th century, make no mistake about it, that is supposed to be one heck of an ugly, frightening serpent's tail divided in two.
Study the sea serpent Nagas and the Eastern cultures.
So the stories of Melusine, when they become a very firm part of Western folklore in the 16th century and then go out to the New World, where everybody knows I eventually bring people because that's really my specialty, and we'll see what happens to Melusine when she gets to the French colonies in the New World. The stories of the Nagas, which are the kind of serpent sirens from India, and also water deities, are taken to the New World because the Portuguese who get to the New World have first colonized parts of India. Remember? Vasco da Gama gets there first. But the Portuguese, like their cousins the Spanish, have a whole large New World empire. And when the whole thing is taken over by Spain in 1580, all of that folklore merges together. And you can go into churches, colonial churches in Brazil, and see images of the Naga that look like Melusine. Because Spain was a big country at that point, and it had taken over so much of the New World, it also was invading French territory. Notice Melusine has a mirror, because Melusine was supposed to be very beautiful. She was the daughter of a water nymph, a Celtic water nymph associated all over with wells and springs in northwestern France. Her mother's name was Presina, and Presina fell in love with the king of Albion. Anybody know what country Albion would be? Okay, it's always mistranslated as Albania, and that makes the story rather odd. If you read that and think it's Albania, you'll think, whoa, the story really got around. The White Cliffs of Albion. Thank you, England. Okay, and this goes back to the early Celtic period in English history, or the period when the Celts and the Saxons were fighting each other between the 5th to the early 9th century. So Presina, who's Celtic, French Celtic, falls in love with the king of Albion. They have 3 daughters. One of them is Melusine, and her 2 sisters, Melior and Palatine. And everything is positively groovy. Everything is wonderful between Presina and Albion, except that she has imposed one strict obligation on Albion, that he can never see her when she is nursing her triplets, one of whom is Melusine. I have to point out that whenever fairy folk, supernatural sprites like Presina, marry a mortal, there will always be these issues involved. Are you familiar with the word taboo? Okay, so there will always be a taboo. There will always be a rule that cannot be broken, and when it's broken, it will lead to dreadful, dreadful consequences. Well, one day Albion breaks in on Presina, and that ends that marriage. And she takes the 3 daughters off with her to the Isle of Avalon. Do you know that isle from any other place? Where? King who? King Arthur. And that also points up the Celtic patronymic of this story. Avalon in Celtic, Irish and Welsh and Northwestern French tradition represents paradise. What it actually means in 5th century Cymric, the language which is still spoken in Wales, although not in its 5th century version, is literally island of apples. It's a symbol of paradise. And Presina takes her 3 daughters, Melior, Melusine, and Palatine, off to Avalon, and they grow up in Avalon. And when Melusine is 15, and she's a very beautiful young woman, always admiring herself in the mirror, she asks her mom, "Mom, why do we know who Dad is?" And Presina says, there's a reason. There's a reason. He broke the taboo. And she breaks down and tells Melusine, Melior, and Palatine the story of how Albion had broken the taboo. And Melior, Melusine's sister, says, "Well, that doesn't sound so bad. Mom, it sounds like he was curious, nothing more." And Palatine says, "Yes, I think we should see our father, King Albion." And Melusine's very quiet. She doesn't say anything, because Melusine is actually confabulating some type of revenge. And the next evening, at twilight, think of twilight, crossroads, times which are considered portals to a kind of supernatural world. Melusine goes off and finds the king of Albion. Yeah, she shouldn't have done this. This is her problem. She was a little too impulsive. And she takes the king of Albion and walls him up in a high tower to punish him for having hurt her mother. Now this is interesting. She goes back. Look at what the story tells us about human relations. She goes back to Avalon thinking that her mother will be very pleased with her, right? See, I punished our dad for not listening to you. Instead, Presina flies into a rage. She's a rather unpleasant character in the story. And she smacks Melusine thrice, all right? Always the number 3, another very sacred number, to a certain degree connected with the idea of the Trinity, but remember, a lot of these stories are from a pre-Christian era. So they're also connected with the idea of the Morrigu. In Celtic tradition, the 3-headed female muse, or shall I say rather 3 female muses stuck together who revolved as though they were one body. She slaps her 3 times and she says, "Melusine, you will never be forgiven for what you have done to me, and your curse will be double." Now, we generally only remember the first part of the curse, but there's a very great writer in Argentina, Manuel Mujica Lainez, who took up the second part of the curse, which is a little bit more difficult to deal with. I'll tell you about that in a minute. We remember the first part of the curse, and the first part of the curse that Presina puts on her daughter Melusine, who again was trying to make her mother happy, right? She says, "You are already the most beautiful of my daughters. I cannot take your beauty from you. But what I can do, and I will do, is make one day a week, and it will be the 7th day, in which you will turn into a monster. And if you find a man who can love you despite that monstrosity, you may marry him. You may in fact marry someone without telling him of your monstrosity, but your union, your marriage will end the minute he sees that monstrosity." And so she gives Melusine the horrible curse of the serpent's tail. So now take a look at the first. We have the first image, which is a bit nicer. The second image is both more sexual and more creepy. Yeah? Because there you see the beautiful woman with a really snaky tail. Now, because Presina was a water nymph, and they went off to the Isle of Avalon, Melusine and her sisters live in the water, but Melusine can also live on land because for 6 days a week, she's a human being. One of the curses given to her other 2 sisters, one is to be walled up in a castle until the end of days. Presina's kind of the mother from hell. And the other one is to become invisible altogether. So she is not a nice woman. Manuel Mujica Lainez, the Argentine writer, wrote about the second curse that Presina gives Melusine, Because when Melusine is going through absolute torture because of this horrible curse, she cries out to her mother and says, "Mother, I will do anything for you. Please give me another body." And this is the part that our writer, Mujica Lainez, takes up. Priscina appears and she says, "Melusine, you want another body? Okay, I'll give you another body." And she gives her a man's body. And she leaves her with a woman's spirit in a man's body. Melusine grows up, you know, and she's a spectacularly beautiful woman except one day a week. And so what she does, she leaves the Isle of Avalon and she goes to inhabit all of the wells and creeks and anything connected with water and the coastline of Brittany in northwestern France. She's a very common figure in northwestern France, and you will see her image on many, many places. She is credited with leaving food for the poor, and she generally stays by fountains, and because she is so spectacularly beautiful, men fall in love with her, and because she has no reason to trust any mortal man, she will flirt with them, she will sometimes make love to them, and then she will disappear. She doesn't trust any man with loving her enough to be able to not ask her secret of where she goes on Saturday and why she must completely disappear on Saturday. In the French story, she meets a Count Raymondine of the House of Lusignan, and for the first time she falls in love with a man. And she decides to do something till that point she has not done, which is offer herself in marriage. And she does to Raymondine. And they fall madly in love, except this weird taboo exists that one day a week he may not see her. And again, that day is very suggestively Saturday, and I just say this because if you want to take a look at medieval European folklore, which often has very weird attitudes towards people of other religions, there was a great deal of suspicion against Jews for having a different Sabbath than Christians. And so, because our Sabbath is on a Saturday and the Christian Sabbath is on a Sunday, this was something that often raised eyebrows, except you're going to find that most of the racism or anti-religious bias tends to come more from the upper classes. The lower classes generally really didn't care very much whom you prayed to. And so it's a not unsympathetic attitude towards Melusine. And Raymondine says, "Well, you know what? You want Saturday off? I'll let you have it." And they have 3 children, except the tragedy is each of the children is born terribly deformed. Now, is anybody aware of attitudes towards the deformed in late medieval Europe? They were pretty horrible. And by the way, this continues into the early modern period. Have you ever heard of the word bedlam? This is total bedlam, this is craziness. Right, bedlam was a ditch in England, which later became an ersatz mental asylum, where people with deformities or people with mental infirmities were thrown into the ditch. And other people would go and laugh at them, including a very cultured English poet from what we used to call the Renaissance, Sir Philip Sidney, who said, quote unquote, "We laugh at deformity." That's very ugly, isn't it? Melusine is a counterweight to that, because Melusine is supposed to have loved her children and to have stopped Count Raymondine from killing the children when they were born deformed. So Melusine also becomes the patroness of people who had physical deformities. That's very powerful in cultures that did not accept physical deformities. When the story was translated into German in the late 15th century, and take a look at the slide closer to my hand, it's a very, very powerful image. Notice the look of terror on Melusine's face. She does not want her German knight, who is the one she meets after Raymondine basically betrays her. When he comes in and spies on her when she's in her bath one Saturday and screams when he sees the serpent's tail, and he expels her from the Lusignan castle in Poitou, and she turns into a dragon and goes up into the air shrieking and promises that she will appear flying in the sky, this sea serpent in the sky, 3 days before the death of any member of the House of Lusignan. Okay, so this relationship did not end well. She goes off to the forests of Germany, and there, in the German version, she meets a German knight who is supposed to be an older man. Okay, so he's finally grown up. Take a look at the image because he is portrayed as being older. And although he is horrified when he accidentally sees Melusine transforming into the two-tailed serpent, unlike Raymondine, he decides to keep her and to be a good husband to her. And the problem is that Melusine does not trust him enough to keep the taboo, even though he has done so. And in one of her most unwise moments, she decides he's not to be trusted because she's convinced she is simply too horrible for him to look at, and she leaves him. Now he goes mad because he loves her, but after she's gone for a number of years, he has to remarry because he is a knight. He has to make sure that he has some sort of issue. It could be biological, it could be adopted, but he needs somebody to inherit his property. And he calls for Melusine to come back, and she doesn't. And so he remarries. And then Melusine appears at the wedding. This is one of the most frightening images of the Melusine legend, just as he, the German knight, and his new wife are about to consecrate their marriage with a kiss. They see a snake tail in the window, and a little bit of blood drips down from the ceiling, and the German knight realizes that is Melusine come back. And this is a very moving story. The German knight goes outside and sees Melusine sitting threateningly on the rooftop and says, "Melusine, my dear, you know I always loved you, and you abandoned me. Would you kill me now in death? Would you leave me with no sons?" He said, "I wanted to adopt your sons. You didn't allow me to do that. Are you going to kill my bride?" And Melusine realizes she's made a mistake. She's becoming as vengeful in an unjustified way with this young woman as her mother was with her. And so Melusine leaves her German knight with, I think, the saddest goodbye. That's not Auf Wiedersehen, right? Because Auf Wiedersehen, we see each other again. This is just so long. And she disappears forever. But all throughout Germany, there are wells consecrated to her that continue to be consecrated to this day. Okay, so she's a very interesting character in terms of representing the eternal outsider. Now, this part of France, northwestern France, Brittany, is very, very different to the rest of France because it is Celtic. The Celtic tradition of Brittany places it as the resting place of Arthur's magician and prophet and advisor. Who am I talking about? Merlin. Exactly. Because Brittany is the place where the sea nymph Nimue, or the sea nymph Vivian, or by some tokens, Melusine's two sisters, Melior and Palatine, seduced Merlin and walled him up in a rock in Brittany, which is still shown to tourists as the rock where Merlin is sleeping. But Merlin has to sleep a certain amount of years because Merlin, I don't know if you know this, lives backwards. So he's supposed to have been born at the age of 10,000. He gets younger every year, and he will supposedly wake up and move that rock in Brittany when he reaches the ripe young age of 100. So this is an area steeped in Celtic folklore, and in the Western Celtic tradition, the tradition of the west of Ireland, the northwest of France, and to a certain degree Wales, the Western Ocean always plays a very big part. In Celtic tradition, paradise is always in the Western Ocean, whether it's Avalon, the island of apples of the Welsh Celts, or Tir na Og, which interestingly enough also appears for the French Celts in Brittany, and of course Ireland, the land of eternal youth. It's always set in the West. And this is the area to which Melusine goes in the legend after she messes up what could have been a good relationship with her German knight. She goes to the oceans of the west, and she forms a pact with Mannanen, MacLear, Mannanen, the son of the sea god Lear. In this pact, we're going to see Melusine can also sometimes find, dare I say, marital satisfaction, because guess what? There are male sirens and female sirens. There are mermen and merwomen. And so we have an entire colony of these rather odd sea people who, some like Melusine, can walk on land when they so wish, at least 6 days a week, and some who cannot. In the Americas, many of the native peoples, including the Mayan Indians, and even the Aztecs who were much more landlocked, and the Inca Indians on the Pacific, in the mountains of Peru, who also went across to the Pacific, to Easter Island, they had their own stories of women who were half human and half fish or half serpent. And when the Melusine stories travel with Breton and Irish sailors to the New World, the traditions will fuse. So in the back, of course, you have an image of a ship called the Flying Dutchman, which is supposedly a 17th century ship manned by a Dutch sailor who was trying to get around the coast of what is now South Africa, and told the crew on a stormy night, "You will not jump this ship. You will not leave me alone. You will never jump this ship." And then, of course, it becomes a ghost story. Nobody could jump the ship. And the ship became the ghostly Flying Dutchman, which continues to round the southern coast of South Africa, and sometimes sails out to the New World. And it's sighted in the Caribbean, and it's sighted in the Pacific, and it's sighted anywhere where pirates have had a lot of rum and time to tell stories. Nothing has been as good for the folkloric process as rum. So Melusine, with that name, starts turning up in maritime sea lore. In the late 16th and early 17th century, she has swum out to the New World. And we have a stunningly beautiful image here by the American illustrator Howard Pyle. If you don't know Howard Pyle, do please Google him. Fantastic illustrator of old Celtic legends. King Arthur, and many, many others. And we have an image here of Melusine in the typical siren's role. She lures the sailors to her, and then she kills them. Well, is that a nice thing to do? You see, in the New World, she's given a bit of, shall I say, a judicial role. She metes out justice to men who have not treated women well. There you see her, that must be on a Saturday when her tail is in its full glory. And Melusine will punish those who rape women. She will punish those who mistreat women. Now, in the Hebrides, in northern Scotland, where we have folklore connected with the Norse, with the Celts, with anybody else who happened to be in that area, these stories from the Hebrides turn up in Jamaica in the early 17th century. And in those stories, Melusine will ride the manatee, which is interesting because that's, this is a New World creature, no manatees in the Old World. And the manatee is every bit as supernatural as Melusine, because the manatee will actually bring those sailors who need to be punished directly to Melusine. Now, can you not hug that? Right? Isn't that incredibly cute? Okay, but this manatee may be cute, but he's no jerk, okay? So the manatee follows the sailors who have done wrong, and he will bring them to Melusine and her New World cousins. If you take a look at the first image, well, the image closer to my hand, it says the mermaid asks for the king's child. This is a very famous variant on the Melusine legend that you will find in Argentina in the 16th, 17th, and into the 18th century. And it's part of a story that Manuel Mujica Lainez wrote called La Sirena, the Siren, in which the Melusine character pops up and tries to impede the conquest of Rio de la Plata, the Silver River, which Spain is embarking upon, and she seduces the captain of the ship. The Melusine character, by the time you get to the early 18th century, was so well known in the New World that many people didn't realize it had actually originated in northwestern France in the Old World. In those colonies conquered by France, the legend came. And here's where Brazil comes into it. Does that strike you as weird? Brazil, it wasn't conquered by France. Okay, now wake up to one of the oddest bits of French history. Go online and Google France in 16th century Brazil. And you will find that there was a huge effort by France to colonize Brazil in the 16th century. Okay, and it was called Antarctic France. Okay, France down in the south. And there was a very, very important French colony run by somebody named Jean de Lery in 16th century Brazil. Most of those people were French Protestants, Huguenots, fleeing religious persecution in France. Many were also Catholic, and all of them brought the story of Melusine. And it is not accidental that in the areas colonized by France in Brazil, later we have the story of Yara. And Yara combines the Melusine story. Melusine is a wronged female with another element. Yara has been raped by her brothers. And Yara, who is Melusine as well, now sits and waits for all sailors who have dared to mistreat women, and she will bring them down to the depths. And finally, at the end, here we come. Starbucks. They didn't invent that logo, and their first coffee shop in Seattle in the early 90s used this two-tailed mermaid. Now, Melusine is the only mermaid in Western folklore who has a split tail. And when she travels to the New World, to Brazil, to Haiti, to everywhere she gets in the New World, that split tail is always the sign of Melusine. What is the connection between that and your latte? Okay. I'll be damned if I can tell you. I will tell you one thing that seems to be said a lot in popular media, which is that in the corporate world there is, and this probably won't surprise many of you, there's a lot of interest in mysticism. You know that Wall Street boys are very famous for frequenting fortune tellers in Lower Manhattan. Oh, somebody has to tell you what's going to happen economically. Okay, and there are entire bits of corporate folklore which are very connected to mystical or magical earlier folklore. And as to why she was chosen, I don't know. What I do know is that Starbucks has fully admitted that yes, this is one of the original shields of the House of Lusignan. That's Melusine.
My name is Robert SEPEHR. I'm an anthropologist. Please check out my books available on Amazon. I'd like to say thank you to those who support me on Patreon. There should be a link below. Kindly share and please hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe. I look forward to reading your thoughts in the comments section. Have a wonderful weekend, and I hope to see you again soon.